Well, good afternoon. It's Melanie again. I'm wanting to share a little bit more about childhood trauma. Just been for a beautiful walk in the countryside here in Devon, looking out over the fields on a sunny day, over towards the estuary, which is where we live. And I've been thinking quite a bit about what I'd like to share on childhood trauma. You see, when I went through medical school, we didn't really learn much about trauma at all. I learned about accidents and that kind of obvious physical trauma. There was a little bit known about emotional trauma, but not very much. And so I've made it my business, really, as part of my work that I do, to research childhood trauma and keep up to date with the latest that's out there. So I want to share a little bit about some of the actual information that I teach, and that is part of my training. So first of all, definition. I mean, how does one define childhood trauma? Childhood trauma is any event, really, that seriously disrupts their nervous system and their brain. Children are very, very vulnerable, and the younger they are, the more vulnerable they are to having the nervous system disrupted. The nervous system is what responds to trauma, you see. So they can be affected on all four levels of their existence. A child can, just the same as adults can, but it's much more marked in children. So they can be affected physically, they can be affected emotionally, mentally, of course, their mental capacity, and their spiritual happiness and well-being in the world. So you might be wondering then, what sorts of trauma can do this? What sorts of trauma can interrupt a child to this degree? Well, I put it into two broad categories, actually. There's trauma that can occur outside, that is something that cannot be helped. It's an environmental situation. These can be things such as war, poverty, being in a refugee camp. I, of course, was in South Africa, and we had many very similar to refugee camps where children grew up in poverty, but also with a lot of, gun violence on the streets. That's very traumatic for children. And then, of course, the massive things like fires and floods and tsunamis. And then the individual environmental trauma could be a loss of a parent, loss of a whole family through accidents, illness, injury, hospitalizations. So these are all the external things that are unexpected, and they can have a huge impact on the child. I think that certainly my profession, the medical profession, recognizes that impact. Certainly there is a lot of help for families who suffer such an environmental trauma. The one that's more hidden and less well recognized is the interpersonal trauma. What do I mean by interpersonal trauma? Well, there are many very good trauma experts at the moment in the world, and perhaps the most well known is Bessel van der Kolk. And he's actually called childhood trauma complex childhood trauma, CPTSD. CPTSD. So it's like PTSD, but it's got a C in front of it. And why did he call it that? Why did he decide to give it a new name? He said because it's a very complex situation that happens to a child. When a child's nervous system is disrupted by daily little things, it doesn't have to be one big thing. It can be one big thing. But generally speaking, the interpersonal traumas are things that occur between the child and the family, the child and the mother, the child and the siblings. Whatever it is an interpersonal, relational situation. And the range of these can include emotional trauma, emotional abuse, physical abuse such as beatings, and so on. Sexual abuse. I think everybody by now knows that sexual abuse is an extremely traumatic and violating thing for a child. It leaves awful scars. And then the most common of all, actually, I believe in America, I heard last year that the commonest childhood abuse that they are looking at is neglect, where the child's needs are not met, where they're simply neglected.